thank you everybody for joining us today on this webinar. We are recording it and we'll be sending out the recording, but please feel free to ask questions via the chat feature to the presenters, and they will be open to answering questions at the end. I'd like to introduce Daniel Colon and Michael Schreiner are both with Tucker Arensberg attorneys, and Michael von Lehman is with Schneider Downs. They will be presenting some information about understanding your options during these times and bankruptcies, how to get from point A to point B, and help you with understanding what you could be thinking about right now. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, Daniel, to do some introductions.
Thank you, Hope. Thank you for that that kind introduction. I want to thank the PRLA for allowing us to speak on this platform to some of your members on a topic that we think is very important to your members at this time, and hopefully all your members can benefit from it. But just to expand a little bit more on the introductions, my name is Daniel Conlon. I'm at the law firm of Tucker Arensberg. I am in the business and corporate group here at Tucker Arensberg, where I work with a number of hospitality clients, single location restaurants, chains, breweries, and I lean on our expertise here at the firm when it comes to bankruptcy. So I'm not, the disclaimer is that I'm not a bankruptcy attorney, but Mike Schreiner, who's presenter today, is the co-chair of our bankruptcy and creditor rights group. He's participated in some of the larger bankruptcies here in the city of Pittsburgh and does have experience working with hospitality clients as well. I'm sure he'll probably be able to weave in some of those anecdotes. And also another presenter is Mike Van Lehman. Mike is the director of a group called Meridian, which is a subsidiary of an accounting firm called Schneider Downs. It's a large regional accounting firm here in Pittsburgh. And what Mike does at Meridian is that he specializes in turnarounds and turnaround situations and also corporate restructuring. Mike has also, we thought of Mike when planning this webinar because Mike does have experience working with corporate restructuring for hospitality clients as well. So I just on a personal note, a lot of my clients that I've worked with for several years, right now, one of the main things that I'm getting questions about are leases, commercial leases. And when negotiating some of these commercial leases, bankruptcy seems to have popped up. So it's not necessarily an area I've dealt with before, but bankruptcy seems to be coming up as maybe a tool that some hospitality clients can use in their negotiations, in their lease negotiations. So with that, I'm done with my presentation. Mike Schreiner, I don't know if you want to take it from here and give us an overview of what we'll discuss.
Sure. Hey, this is Mike. I'm hoping everybody can hear and or see me. I've been working with clients across the hospitality industry for years, whether it's in lodging or in restaurants, the restaurant space. And everybody has been, unfortunately and significantly challenged by the recent events. And what I'd like to do is throw this to Mike Von Lehman first. Mike's gonna run through a list of things, if you're not doing, you should be right now. And then we'll get into some of the options for when this isn't necessarily enough and you're either in trouble with your leases for your property or your equipment leases, or in with your bank. So Mike.
Thank you, Mike. So again, my name is Mike Von Lehman. As Dan said, I run Schneider Downs Meridian for Schneider Downs and Company, the large accounting firm. I deal with, and Mike Schreiner will tell you the same thing. We don't deal exclusively in restaurants and hotels and lodges. We kind of deal with whatever comes to the door, and it could be anything under the sun, and most of the same principles apply. You want the same outcomes, and you need to have the same clear plan to achieve those outcomes. Some of the things, and this is a little bit dated at this point, This was something that we drew up in March when kind of everything first shut down. And depending on the size of your establishment, if you're a restaurant group, you should probably be looking hard at all of these things. If you're a single one-off hotel operator or restaurant, some of these things, developing a COVID task force probably means that's yourself. But it's a way to kind of think through some of these things. So one of the things we stress to people is, as I said, develop a COVID task force, have people that are carving out some amount of time in their day strictly to deal with the COVID issues and how to move forward and how to plan around those. Another thing we stress, and this is almost one of the biggest things that you're going to see throughout this presentation, is make sure you're communicating. You have to make sure you're communicating with your lenders. You have to make sure you're communicating with your landlords and your employees. Everybody to date has kind of understood that this is hopefully a once in a lifetime phenomenon, if not a once in 50-year phenomenon that isn't anyone's doing. And so most people have been willing to work, but you have to open up those lines of communications, because what you don't want to do is pick avenue A because of an assumption of how somebody is going to react without actually having taken that communication. For instance, you don't want to go into bankruptcy to try to avoid a lease if you could have had a simple conversation with them and found a business way to get out of that. Supply chain management, most of these fears have probably quelled a little bit, but certainly 6 months ago, if you have sole source providers that are the only way to get something, you probably want to make sure you at least have a backup plan in mind in case something happens to them. We could see a lot of your vendors or suppliers start to go out of business or run into the same issues you have, not to mention shortages due to just production issues that are going on. Build contingency plans. We don't know what's going to happen, so you should be looking at kind of a best, middle, and worst case at all times and what you're going to do. Make sure you understand where your labor force is at, what they need from you, what you need from them, and work with them. Modeling the financial impact. This is easier said than done, and it's easier the larger you get because you have scalability and you might have a CFO or a controller that can help do this. But you really need to know specifically where your cash is going to be at any given time. You need to know what sales do you need to hit to break even. You need to know what expenses can you push and how much do you need to push them. It does no good to go in and ask your landlord to forgive 50% of your rent if 100% of your rent forgiveness wouldn't even help you survive. You have to know exactly what your targets are. Even if they're moving, you have to have a good idea. So we always tell people, make sure you're modeling your financials, make sure you're doing cash flow analyses, and make sure you're doing them consistently and doing different scenarios under them. If you run a bigger restaurant group or larging enterprise, then we really talk about increasing reporting. You want to know what your daily sales are rather than maybe waiting till the end of the week or the end of the month. You really want to be on top of everything, because if something is trending, normally you'd take a month or 2 or 3 months or even 6 months to let a trend kind of play itself out to make sure it wasn't small sample size. You don't necessarily have that ability right now. You probably need to start making decisions based on much shorter time periods, because you might not have the cash to survive 3 months, and then it says, oh, well, it turns out I should have been staffed at 50%. You have to make those decisions very quickly. And probably the last thing, and this is probably inherent in what everybody's doing, it's time to hoard cash as much as you can. And that means negotiating with everybody you can to delay payments, to push payments, to ask for forgiveness. Once you pay a bill, you can't get that money back. So you have to be absolutely 100% certain that when something goes out the door, it needs to go out the door. Now, obviously, you're going to pay your employees, you're going to pay your trust taxes, things of that nature, but you have some more wiggle room. I would also say the last part of this that isn't on here is get creative. People tend to think of dealing with their landlord in binary terms of, do I pay them or do I not pay them? The idea isn't to not pay your landlord if you're doing well. So think about negotiating, hey, I'll give you some percentage of gross receipts over X amount, because you know if you make over X amount, you know, then you have enough cash to survive. So then you can start piecing them in. Get creative with your solutions and try to find a way that works for everybody, gives everybody upside, and everybody shares in the pain if that's the way you are. But you really have to be creative in these times, and don't let any one thing get in your way. Try to problem solver when it comes to this stuff. And that's kind of the mindset you have to. Now, as we go forward, if you're doing all these things, you can still run into circumstances that's not working. But these are kind of the things that you should be doing in the back of your mind or on paper already. If you haven't done these things and you're kind of skipping to the should I declare bankruptcy, you should stop and go back and do these things as quickly as possible. And then you can have a very meaningful conversation with Mike or Dan about what your possibilities are.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Why don't we move on to the next slide? And before we talk about bankruptcy a little more and its alternatives, let me stress one thing. Filing bankruptcy is the absolute last thing any business wants to do. We always, whenever our clients come to us in financial distress, try to find another solution besides filing bankruptcy. Sometimes it happens, but I would say you're probably easily at 98% of the time people come to us thinking they're going to have to file bankruptcy. We end up not having to file bankruptcy for them. We find another solution. And one of those solutions is trying to get money. And I think we got some good news. You know, last night it does look like there's a deal in place, with Congress for another round of PPP funding. Now, this isn't going to be quite the cash giveaway it was last time. Because they're actually asking borrowers to demonstrate a 30% reduction in gross receipts year over year, 2019 versus 2020, to be eligible for the second round of financing. Of course, for most people in the hospitality industry, it shouldn't be all that hard to meet that standard. And the other piece of clarity we got from Congress is that the expenses that were paid with PPP loan proceeds will be deductible. So there won't necessarily be a tax bill that a lot of people were extremely concerned about with respect to that first round of PPP financing as well. Now, when we talk about bankruptcy alternatives, the first thing we really do is pick up the phone and talk to the critical creditors. We talk to the landlords. We talk to the banks, we talk to key suppliers, and we try to find, a way where, we recognize that they have concerns, they want to be paid, and that's generally their concern. But they also understand that if a restaurant or a hotel is forced out of business, that their prospects for repayment dim significantly. We've had a lot of clients in the last, since March of last year, approach their banks and receive, payment deferrals from their lenders. In fact, not just going to interest only, but, complete, essentially payment deferrals for really the last 9 months. And we see those deferrals continuing to some point in the future. Now, your landlord's going to approach you if you talk about a complete payment deferral and say, well, what about my my loans? But they're also receiving deferrals, and they also have, customers who are paying their rent. So it really is a wiggle room here. There is room to negotiate and try to find one of those, mutually agreeable solutions or creative solutions that Mike was talking about.
Well, Mike, I think here's also, I think here, if you could talk a little bit, because here's where bankruptcy can actually, without filing bankruptcy can actually be a tool, I think, for you in those calls, because if you're not afraid of bankruptcy, you can use that as a little bit of leverage with the landlords and the banks, because they don't as much as an entity doesn't want to go into bankruptcy, they don't want you to go into bankruptcy. If they're getting good counsel, they don't want you to go into bankruptcy either.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example from one of the big national cases that actually went in. As I think most of you are aware, Ruby Tuesday's holding company filed for Chapter 11 along with all the corporate stores around the country, and they've been, not paying rent in their bankruptcy case and arguing that they're entitled to essentially abating their rent under the force majeure clauses that are contained in their leases. Now, candidly, I believe this argument is a little bit of a stretch, but there are courts out there who are buying into it right now. And just the ability to say, look, if you're not going to be reasonable with us, if you're not going to work with us, we'll file bankruptcy and we'll ask the bankruptcy court to excuse our obligation to pay rent under the force majeure clause in our lease. You might actually get somewhere with your landlord because they really don't want you to file. It increases their expense because they have to get counsel involved. It causes a delay in their receiving payments, and it really, it can also cause them to have to report something to their lenders and put them in default with their banks as well. Like I said, the scenario we prefer and the scenario where most of these cases resolve is the workout. And that's sort of a generic term for reaching an agreement with each of your key constituencies so you can keep operating until we're on the other side of this pandemic. Sometimes when there's a significant amount of secured debt and there's been a real breakdown in the relationship between with the bank, the banks will seek to have what's called a receiver appointed. The receiver takes over and operates the business, generally with the goal of selling it and getting the bank repaid. The only positive about a receivership is that it typically presents an opportunity for the principals who have personally guaranteed the bank debt to negotiate releases of their personal guarantees in exchange for their cooperation in the receivership. Sometimes, if there are no personal guarantees, if everything's in the corporate name and you just can't make it work, sometimes the absolute best bet is simply to close up the doors and send out a note to all of your key constituencies saying, hey, look, we tried, with circumstances beyond our control. We're very sorry, but we've had to shut down. Now, if we could go on to the next slide, I'll tell you a few of the things about bankruptcy and some of the myths and concerns that are out there.
So Mike, this is Daniel here. If I could just bring attention to one note, though. A lot of restaurant owners seem to have personal guarantees on their lease. So how does the personal guarantee affect a business owner's decision to file bankruptcy?
Well, there's several things that play into the personal guarantee analysis. The first is, the owner of the restaurant, if you have a personal guarantee, you have to look at the question of how are your assets owned? Because if you're married and you own your assets jointly with your spouse, even if you have a personal guarantee and it's only from you, then realistically, the creditor can't do very much with that. They can't touch your joint property like a home you own with your spouse. They can't get bank accounts that are titled jointly with your spouse. And in Pennsylvania, creditors cannot attach your wages. So they can't garnish, they can't grab your wages. And as long as your wages get deposited into a joint checking account, they're generally going to be protected. So that's an important question. when there are assets and there is exposure on a personal guarantee, then you have the question of if the business isn't going to make it, can the business make it? If you decide the business is going to make it, oftentimes what happens is you put the effort into the business and you negotiate a standstill with the creditor where they don't chase you on the personal guarantee, at least while you're trying the bankruptcy. And sometimes, if pushed, the last alternative in that situation is a personal bankruptcy. And, a personal bankruptcy doesn't mean you're going to lose everything you own. It doesn't mean you're going to ruin your reputation. It doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means that a business was unsuccessful and there were adverse consequences. And that does happen sometimes. And, the banks, the lenders, everybody out there in the industry expects and understands that a certain percentage of leases that they enter into, loans that they make, are going to go bad and get into these situations and have to be worked out.
And I would say on top of that, Mike, given the present economy, I'd say there's almost going to be zero. I can't imagine there's going to be a stigma attached to bankruptcy, particularly in the hospitality industry moving forward from this time period.
Yeah, I think you can't emphasize that enough. In fact, right now, especially if you look at landlords, they are, let's say it's a booming, forget the pandemic for a moment. Let's say it was a booming economy and a landlord is getting inquiries about, restaurant space frequently. Well, then, if one of their tenants defaults, they might be more inclined to be aggressive because they feel like they could get a replacement tenant in there pretty quickly, and they could negotiate a favorable lease, perhaps even for a higher lease rate and without having to spend a lot on build out. However, right now, restaurants have been, as we're all aware, restaurants have closed and the demand for new space is significantly reduced. And that really gives your landlord an incentive to work with you, because it's easier to rehabilitate you and the relationship with you than it is to find somebody new to take over the space, especially if that's going to result in significant costs to bring the space up to date, and given reduced demand, lower rents. Generally, there are three kinds of bankruptcies that are out there, and they present different options for different scenarios. There's a Chapter 7, which is a straight up liquidation. It's you surrender, you quit, your assets get handed over to a trustee whose job it is to sell those assets for the benefit of your creditors. Generally, Chapter 7 is only a good option for individuals, not for any kind of a corporate form, because only individuals get a discharge in a Chapter 7. Corporations that go out of business don't get a discharge, and typically for individuals, in 98% of the cases, the trustees don't actually sell any of their assets. They don't actually take any of their assets. It's a short process. It's over in 90 to 120 days. And you get the holy grail of bankruptcy, which is a discharge from all of your debts at the end of that process. That means creditors can't send you nasty letters anymore. They can't call you up and harass you. And you are generally at that point by banks perceived as a good credit risk. One primary reason being you're not eligible to file another bankruptcy again for 7 to 8 years. So they know that you can't discharge them again. The next kind of bankruptcy is a Chapter 11, and that's generally what we use when we're trying to save or reorganize a business. It gives you an opportunity to negotiate a repayment plan with creditors and to force terms onto certain of your creditors who otherwise have refused to agree to do something outside of bankruptcy. In 2019, Congress passed what was called the Small Business Reorganization Act, and they tried to make Chapter 11 easier and less burdensome for smaller businesses. And they actually succeeded in doing that. They reduced a lot. They removed a lot of the reporting requirements. They removed the they made it easier to confirm a plan, and they have made it simpler to get through the process, which generally reduces the expense and makes it more feasible for someone who has basically, $5 or $6 million or down of debt. And then the last kind of bankruptcy that's generally out there is Chapter 13. This is essentially a simplified Chapter 11 for individual wage owners who have up to about $1.5 million of debt. This is only available for individuals. You can't file if you're a corporation or an LLC, but if you're an individual who owns a restaurant on their own, this can provide a real opportunity, or for a pair of spouses who own something together, to reorganize it and get a payment plan in place and hold on to your assets. And under Chapter 13, you can get 5 years to get caught up on your debts and to cure arrearages under your leases and with your banks. Perhaps the most important thing you get when you file bankruptcy is breathing space, because when you file bankruptcy, the court puts in place what's called the automatic stay, which stops all of your creditors from chasing after you or harassing you, and that gives you breathing room. It lets the restaurant that's been stressed, that's been in trouble, to catch its breath and start focusing on trying to fix everything. And the end of that process, you keep it open, you reach deals with your landlord, with your banks, because once you're in the format of the bankruptcy court encourages these kinds of deals, and bankruptcy cases get done by having deals happen. And that can let you keep your restaurant open, and it can allow you to discharge your debts at the end of the day. Now, the downside is, if it's unsuccessful, your assets, in the business can get liquidated. But generally, we're not filing bankruptcy unless we have to. So we were probably facing that threat anyway before we went in. And when you file a business, if you do have personal guarantees, this doesn't protect your personal assets from, that doesn't protect a creditor from going after you personally. That said, the vast majority of creditors will negotiate on both the personal guarantee and the business side. And a lot of them, so long as you keep the guarantee in place. Yes, Mike.
Does when you talk about it doesn't expunge your personal guarantees, what effect does it have for trust tax issues? So if or payroll issues for the employer or for the companies?
Yeah. Well, one of the single most important things that Mike and I both tell our clients is that you need to pay your trust fund taxes. You need to pay your employees' payroll, because if you when money is set aside to pay payroll, when Social Security and other trust fund taxes or sales taxes are collected, if you don't remit those to the IRS, you as an individual, or to the state Department of Revenue, you as the individual who's responsible for signing the checks for the business, can be personally liable for those taxes. So those are, even if you didn't have personal guarantees, if you don't pay your trust fund taxes, you can be personally on the hook for them. So it's very important to make sure those get paid. And, the bankruptcy, Yeah, bankruptcy provides a process, and as Mike said, oftentimes simply the ability to say, look, I've talked with my lawyer about filing bankruptcy is really enough to get your creditors to start talking to you and reaching deals with you, because a lot of them have had bankruptcy experiences, whereas the creditor, it wasn't terribly favorable to them. And they've learned from that that it's better to reach a deal outside, because you often get a better deal outside of bankruptcy. Mike, you have any other thoughts on sort
Well, I
of
think
the key things for avoiding?
I think that, well, whether you're going into bankruptcy or not going into bankruptcy, bankruptcy isn't a fix-all by any stretch of the imagination. Just as if you were staying out of bankruptcy, I think one of the things that Mike would stress is there has to be a cohesive plan. You don't go into bankruptcy just to go into bankruptcy. It has to be part of a global plan. And bankruptcy can certainly help if you're dealing with an obstinate landlord or an obstinate lender, or obstinate vendors. But it isn't, it won't fix all your problems. Once you're in bankruptcy, you are going to have an enterprise that makes money and produces positive cash flow. You are going to have to do these same things. So I always hesitate when people start thinking about bankruptcy. You know, a lot of times they think about it as the end of the road. You know, hey, we tried everything, let's do bankruptcy. But that's not how bankruptcy works. And I'm sure Mike would reiterate this as well. It works much better if it's part of a plan. It's not the end of a plan. It is in the middle or the beginning of a plan. It just is a different plan than you wanted at the beginning. You'd like to have a plan that avoids bankruptcy, but sometimes that's not possible. But it really has to be a well thought out and cohesive plan put in place with tangible goals that you want to accomplish. You certainly don't want to just declare bankruptcy willy-nilly because the landlord sent you a threatening letter. It's really a means, it's really a tool in your tool chest, and you should consider it as such rather than it being a destination that you end up at.
Yeah, and it's really crucial to engage with your creditors. I have, hospitality clients right now in the lodging industry who have received 9 months of no payments because, their banks have basically said, look, we'll just tack it onto the balloon at the end 5 years from now. We would much rather have you get reopened and resume making monthly payments to us than have to deal with, liquidating and selling your hotel property in what is probably the worst market for selling hotel properties right now. The only thing that comes these days from forcing a liquidation is locking in a significant loss. And most creditors are counting on the fact that the pandemic is temporary and that travel will resume, that indoor dining will resume, and that property values will bounce back. So if they force you to liquidate when property values are low, they're insuring their own loss. And by and large, they know that.
Yeah, I think everybody's taking the approach, lenders, landlords, and business owners of, right now isn't the time to make big, huge decisions. Right now is about surviving and advancing. It's about how do we get through the next 120, 180 days. And even if some restaurants and some hotels do go bankrupt and do go out of business, how can you not be in that group of going out of business so that when it does come back, you might have less competition, and which will help you kind of reinvigorate the industry a little bit from a capacity standpoint and things of that nature. But this is about how do we get from now until August or June or whatever that date is going to have to be. It's about outlining a plan on literally, if you think about it in terms of I'm a sports guy, the NCAA tournament. How do we survive in advance? All we have to do is get to a certain date and time, and then you will be okay. It's just, how do you get there?
Yeah, and again, you can't emphasize it enough, but in this market, it's really in nobody's interest to liquidate. There's excess equipment all over the place. There's excess real estate all over the place. Banks, landlords, equipment vendors, food suppliers, everybody is suffering and putting, more and more hotels and restaurants out of business simply makes it worse right now. And they're aware of that. They really are. And I think you can, that fact is demonstrated, by the fact that the government has even gone so far as to tell banks who normally have to take action against any creditor who goes, any borrower who becomes more than 90 days delinquent, that if you had a healthy customer before the pandemic and they're unable to make payments because of the pandemic, that you can essentially continue, you can push those payments off, you can defer payments, you can move them to interest only, you can make deals that normally you would not be allowed to make because they were healthy before the pandemic. And I think that guidance is going to stay out there for some time. And I do think, with the new administration coming in, we're going to see additional resources made available to small businesses as well, as we try to get to the point where the vaccines are widely distributed and life begins to resume a post-pandemic sense of normalcy. And just let me say, this has happened to huge players in the industry. Like I said, Ruby Tuesdays, California Pizza Kitchen, Bar Louie, NPC. There are giant, restaurant operators out there who have been forced in. But at the same time, it's also been, interestingly, we've seen for chains that were able to pivot quickly and focus on their to-go business, there have been real opportunities there. So again, as Mike was saying, it's about being nimble and responding to the changes in the market condition. I think we were going to take questions at the end, so it might be a good time to open it up right now.
Great, and thank you. You can ask the questions with your mic off if you'd like, or you can use the chat feature. I know that Allison did put an FYI in there for all to know about Pittsburgh's Urban Redevelopment Authority implementing a commercial rent relief grant program, which is awesome. Also, thank you so much, Michael, for presenting this information to us. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question in this open forum, their contact information is up here for you to reach out to if you would rather ask it more on a one-on-one basis. It does seem that nobody's going to ask questions. But again, guys, thank you so much for presenting this information. I think it's good for everybody to be informed on their options and, be thinking, ahead, but to hear your comforting, thoughts on bankruptcy is not where you're looking to go, how not to get there. So I appreciate it. Thank you everybody for joining us today. As always, this is recorded. We'll put this out on our website, but also send it out to the individuals that were registered. And with that said, I guess our webinar is over, and I hope everybody has a safe and healthy and fun holiday with their families, or at home if you decide to stay home.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank
Thanks
you
all.
so much. Thanks, Daniel, for contacting me about this.
Yes, thank you, Hope.
All
We'll be
righty.
in touch. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you. Bye-bye.